Welcome to Outrage Overload, a science podcast about outrage and lowering the temperature. This is episode 51. On today's episode of the Outrage Overload podcast, we're talking about burnout and exhaustion.
This idea of burnout, I think, extends well beyond the healthcare sphere. I think it eats its way into all of our lives to one degree or another with this hyper-complex and multitasked world. And I think one of the byproducts for sure is all the outrage we're seeing.
That's Gary Simonds, MD, a neurosurgeon who teaches at the Virginia Tech Carilion School of Medicine and the Virginia Tech School of Neuroscience. Dr. Simonds has written and spoken extensively on personal wellness, neuroscience, and emotional exhaustion. His most recent book is Death's Pale Flag, a novel that delves deeply into burnout and psychological distress. Dr. Simonds first encountered burnout among his surgical team, where the emotional and physical demands of the job were overwhelming. To address this, Dr. Simonds introduced positive psychology practices that helped his team regain balance and build resilience. I'm your host, David Beckmeyer, and today we'll explore how these same techniques can be applied to our everyday lives, helping us manage burnout in a world overflowing with outrage, negativity, and complexity. Let's dive in. You talk about burnout, and one of the biggest themes of this show is kind of exhaustion, I guess I'll say, and along a couple of different lines. Like, one is folks are exhausted by just the political environment. They're exhausted by the news. They're exhausted by the sort of outrage that's out there, the anger, the being upset all the time. The other side of it is related to the being mad all the time. It's kind of an outrage fatigue. It's like it's hard to be like, there are some things we should probably be outraged about. But when it's just a nonstop barrage of here's another thing to be outraged about, you can't direct. That can't be a very useful. It's not. It sort of loses its purpose as a tool to motivate, right, and cause any action, because you're just angry at everything all the time. So it's hard to know what to do. And in fact, you see this in people's behavior online in particular, I think, but I think you see it also that they just roll back from everything, civic life in general. But you see it online that, the answer to everything is just post something. Like, it's not going to have any effect at all, right? I can be mad at the same thing 3,000 times and it's not going to make any difference. Like, I'm just mad at the same thing and, no one cares and it doesn't do anything.
It all sounds right up any alley I can perceive of what's going on. I think it makes a lot of sense. I guess one of the ways I often present burnout is with a metaphor that we all have kind of a bank of energy within us. And that's the energy that gets us up and out of bed and off to work and to do the activities of daily living and to be civil with one another and all that sort of thing. And everything we encounter, everything we experience, every thought we have either makes a deposit in that bank or makes a withdrawal, if you will. And I would liken burnout to being in a state where you've withdrawn so much that you're just overdrawn. So when you go to put, even if you go to make a deposit, it doesn't have much impact because you're so overdrawn. So what that means is your energy depleted all the time. And we use we use whatever you want to call it, our psychic energy, our emotional energy, indeed, to function in this very complex, very multitasked society. This is without any outrages necessarily being around. And when our energy is depleted, what we've seen is a lot of idiosyncrasies start coming out, and we have a lot of our idiosyncrasies, particularly on the male side, it seems to be, resorts to some sort of anger response, some sort of frustration, anger response. And outrage would neatly fit into that. But also, therefore, when we're exposed constantly to outrage, we're just making those big withdrawals as well. So I think I can see it being a cycle of, you're already depleted. You're acting out already, and that just stirs up even more antipathy and outrage around you, and then that sucks more life out of you, and it just spins round and round.
And in the cases where you've worked with folks on their burnout, have you also found that they're sort of they're not as effective in terms of like they're not as good critical thinkers and things like that? They're having harder time to make decisions and that kind of thing. Or what other kind of effects do you see from this burnout?
Exactly. So again, it takes a certain amount of energy to do a lot of things. Again, just to be civil sometimes would be one thing. But if you think about critical thinking, for example, that takes a lot of energy because what you have to do is shut down your biases, shut down your prejudices, and actually open up your mind to the full scope of whatever the discussion, whatever the argument is at hand, and analyze it in really a scientific way. And that is, what's the validity? What's the evidence? How much can I weigh this? Instead of just leaping onto it, which is what we tend to do. We tend to leap into confirmation bias. So we hold a belief, we leap into it doesn't take any energy. Therefore, when Twitter is continuously serving us up our own opinion, there's no energy. You don't have to step outside, the box. So yeah, I mean, on kind of a psychological level, it really takes out our critical thinking. But you can go into the neuroscience realm if you want, and that is a state of being outraged, a state of being angry, really is switching into kind of the fight or flight components of your brain, your stress response components, which again are kind of survival components of your brain. But what they tend to do is accentuate this fight or flight response, uh, deepen the emotions. Areas like your amygdala get hyper active, and it shuts off. Not completely, obviously, but it shuts down more of your executive function components of your brain, the areas of your brain that really do the high level thinking. So even on the neuroscience level, you can think of how this really takes you out of the thinking mode, the critical thinking mode, the evaluation of the relative merits of a discussion, and shifts you into the no, I've got to be angry. I've got to be prepared for a fight.
Hmm. Right. And as a result of kind of this stream of these outrages, right? How terrible, particularly sort of the outrages performed by the other side, right? It's like what crazy thing did they do now, and then that feeds into that, and we find ourselves in these situations now where many Americans consider the biggest problem in the country the other side. Like it's not taxes, it's not some other issue. It's the other side. Like it's them. Are the biggest problem or them. And
Oh yeah.
and we feel that way. Like a lot of Americans feel that way. And I think, and so we kind of want to fix them. And we end up getting caught because of that cycle you're talking about. We kind of find ourselves feeling kind of dejected, like hopeless, like there's no way out of it. There's nothing I can do, and it kind of just continues to spiral down that as well. Because like the other side's so bad, I can't fix them. There's nothing we can do. So I'm curious, like, have you what kind of success have you had, or what's some ways to maybe turn that spiral around?
Yeah, first of all, what you're describing would be some of the central components of burnout, of the concept of burnout. And the central components are one, an emotional exhaustion, which we've already hit. Two is a lack of empathy, which, when we do the us versus them, that's precisely what we're doing. We're unable, and this has happened on both sides. I see it, all the time, is where you're unable to put yourself into the boots of, quote, them, and therefore their thought processes feel totally foreign, if not, again, outrageous. And then the third major component is nihilism. Is you begin to believe you have no impact, no effect, and we see this on multiple levels. So I'll give you a microcosm response because I've personally seen it turned around. Now, how you do this on a large scale, how you fix the United States, that's going to be, a challenge, and that's clearly what, you're working on. But in our mini universe of my neurological team, neurosurgical team, which I was the head of, we were having a problem with we were continuing to do good work, though. I think, our outcomes were good and we were saving lives and all that sort of stuff. But we were getting into trouble everywhere throughout the system that we were working for. How? Because everybody was teeing up on other people. They were barking, they were sarcastic, they were nasty, they were yelling. Thank goodness we didn't evolve to throwing things, but you hear about surgeons all the time throwing things. So just this anger, hostile type behaviors for our team. So I as a boss, I'm getting 50, 60 formal complaints about our team a month. And you realize this is either going to keel over on its own, it's going to implode, or we've got to do something. And that's when I seized on the idea of burnout, happened to run into a world famous burnout expert and worked with him with my team for a long time. But the long and short of it is we took an approach, I think they call it positive psychology, but it's like they say that 50% of doctors are burning out to one degree or another. So the question is, what are the 50% doing that aren't burning out? And you start getting a series of behaviors, a series of routines that people do who seem to thrive in a challenging situation, in a depleting situation, rather than get broken down. And so that's what we did. We started working on our team, cycling through a whole series of different strategies, exercises to do to see what stuck and see if it helped. And ultimately, it took a while. It took months because there was a lot of cynicism and not wanting to get involved. But ultimately, the complaints about our team went down to zero. The job satisfaction skyrocketed. Our team started getting, awards throughout the system and all by really not major in-depth, psychotherapy, just working on certain behaviors, certain mindsets. And so that's when I became kind of a believer, almost a zealot about this, because you can kind of see similar behaviors everywhere. And I do think we all live in this hyper complex, tasked society. And so we're already kind of running on fumes in many ways. And then you throw into, these bombs of outrage that you've been talking about. And we have a whole industry now that thrives on outrage, right? I mean, they're making money off of outrage. So it gets poured into these already susceptible people, and it becomes very easy to fall into the pattern. There's even, there's like an emotional release, like in the old days with our guys, exploding at people on the floors, yelling at a nurse. You get a momentary charge. You feel momentarily better when you can express outrage. But there are very few people who do well, downstream, being nasty or hating other people. It's the type of thing you wake up in the middle of the night and you say to yourself, how can I act that way?
Right. I mean, some of those things sort of, they have these little short term, feels good in the short term, but yeah,
Yeah.
the long term consequences are not so great.
Yeah, and that's what I mean. I think a lot of Americans, if you, I mean, you just look at the surveys of how they think the country's doing. Well, the country is booming economically. And yet, you look at surveys and people are like, we're doing horrible, everything is horrible. Well, I think they're drained. They can't even see the positivity right now.
Well, yeah, we definitely struggle with that in general. I think that's just all humans maybe struggle with that. When things are too good, you almost look for something. Something must be wrong, and you almost look to go find for things for things that are broken. Um, so how in a practical sense, like where do people start? Like, what if you just want to lower your own stress about this, or become, maybe more able to be effective? I mean, because this is the sort of paradox of it is people say, well, I want to fix it, but like you can't fix it. Like they're sort of concurrently holding on to those two things. I'm so frustrated because you can't fix it, and then also you can't fix it, kind of at the same time.
Yeah, and so as I said, we kind of work through a whole bunch of different strategies, and I'll give you some examples. But one of the things that we've learned with burnout in general, and I would say for all of what you are dealing with, is there's no epiphanies. So you don't get one lecture or one podcast or that sort of thing, and you go, your eyes open up and you say, oh my God, I've been living the wrong way. I've got to change. I'll be better now. I won't be outraged ever again. It just doesn't happen that way. And the another thing is it takes active upfront energy to say, I'm going to change. I'm going to down regulate. I'm going to go in a different direction with this. And, if there's some upfront energy needed, that can be hard when you're energy depleted. But there are many different kind of strategies that can be started and tried, and seeing how it feels, how it makes you feel, how it makes you interact. And what works for Peter doesn't necessarily work for Paul, but all of them need consistency. You have to kind of say, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to make it uh, a part of my daily routine. So, the first two major steps in any sort of resilience building. So, what we're trying to do is build people's resilience. In any major steps in building resilience is what we call self-compassion and self-care. And what that means, again, is sometimes it gets too much psychobabble, so I try to stay away from that. But what it means is we're so busy, we're running around so much, handling so many fires. And now, if you want to throw the outrage on top of that, you spend a lot of your day just getting angry. That we spend very little time actually taking into account, where are we? How do we feel? What's going on in our lives? What do we need out of life? What are we looking for out of life? We just get so externally focused. If you're working a job, that takes a huge amount of this, for example. And so initially up front, one of the first things we have to do is almost kind of run our own diagnostics. And that's to people sit down and say, where am I? How do I feel? What makes me feel better? Does running through these Twitter posts make me feel better? Or what brings me down? What's working in life and what's not? Because it's awfully hard to attend to if you don't even acknowledge it, if you don't even think about it. So that's the one angle, and the second component of that is to say, okay, I'm going to take care of it. I'm going to do something. I'm going to take some action and address these things that are bringing me down. And I'm going to find a way to do the things that put more energy deposits, in my bank, if you will. And another component that we have fixed to all this is guilt. Often, if we do try to take care of ourselves, we start feeling guilty. So we got to kind of, throw guilt out. We have a mantra that says no guilt for self-care and self-compassion. Anyway, from there, you can potentially try a whole number of different strategies. And I could give you two that I think may be apropos here. One is um, the idea, all these are kind of training your brain to go in a different direction, to approach the world in a different way. But one would be to say, um, for the next 2 weeks or 3 weeks, every day, take a piece of paper, take your phone, and look for 5 things that made the day better, that made you feel better. And you could apply this even to quote the enemy if you wanted, to people I know who are on the other side of the divide. What are 5 things today that, that they did that made me feel good, or that was decent? But just in general, we say, 5 things that, put a smile on your face or made you feel, a little better. Bring them home that night, take a look at them for a minute, and just recognize that some decent things happened. And if you do this for about 2 to 3 weeks, you force yourself to do it. What happens is your brain, after a while, it just starts seeking it out itself. And so you begin to see the world in a different light, as less disastrous, as less horrible, as less wretched, as less outrageous. And as you say, we have a tendency to automatically, our default is to look for danger, to look for bad things. So you're kind of training your brain to say, okay, that's okay. You can still be aware of dangers, but what are the decent things? What are the things that are going well in life? And it's very interesting to see that after a while you don't have to force yourself. It just comes. You say, oh, that person thanked me. That's amazing. They're on the other side of the political divide, and they were actually nice to me. That sort of thing. So that would be a example of a simple exercise that can be done for time immemorial, but will help kind of retrain how you approach things. Another one you were talking about before is, as you say, you get this sense of learned helplessness. The world is against me. The system is against me. All it's going to do, rack and ruin is coming, disaster. It's, reminds me of the Rolling Stones, "Gimme Shelter," right? It just, it's all going to come down. And I have no control. There's nothing. It's all them that's doing it to me. And we call it the 90-10 rule. It really should be kind of the 99.999 versus 0.001 rule or whatever. But the idea is to say, to give yourself permission and acknowledge, yeah, you're right. I can't change this political dynamic today. It's not going to, it's not going to change tomorrow. The right isn't going to love the left, and vice versa. So what can I do? Is there anything I can do in my little sphere that is going to have a little positive impact, that's going to make people feel better about the situation? And do it. Think of the things that you can do to contribute to a more positive setting. And what that does is gives a little ripples in a pond effect, because if you're treating people well, they're going to potentially treat other people well. It makes you feel good. Anytime you're nice to somebody, it makes you feel much better than when you're a prick. And then finally, it gives you that sense, I have some control. I do have some control here. You don't need to be totally nihilistic about it. You can have an impact, even if it's not correcting everything. So, your podcast would be an example of the United States isn't going to turn on a dime tomorrow, but you've
wait till
taken
they hear
action.
this episode.
There you go. But you've taken action, right? You've taken action, and I guarantee that there are people who are functioning better because you do this. So, and hopefully then they influence the next person and the next person. And if you have enough, enough things like this going on, hopefully the needle starts to move.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what's hard to keep the focus on and have people still believe that, because, it seems like there's so many things pulling us back to that it's hopeless and I can't do anything about it. All these things you're doing, that's great. I mean, it sounds great. But, and I hear sentences, phrases almost exactly like this. It's like, well, that all sounds good for my mental well-being, but it's, it's not going to change, so-and-so from, being a bad person or whatever. And it's like, yeah, you just threw out a whole bunch of good for this one little bad.
Yeah, but I think again with you, part of it is we are subject to these negative mindsets. And if you can kind of shift that negative mindset, you can't do it by just saying, I'm going to shift my negative mindset. You got to kind of try things that will bring that more in order for you. And this idea, again, of just finding ways to, make an effort to do something to help it. Uh, it, it it's got so many potential benefits. Like I said, it just even feels good to be good to somebody else, or to be kind, or to forgive, can go a long way. And you just don't know how far it goes. You don't know if even if it's in the microsphere of, this is somebody who's angry all the time and they go home and they make their life, make life miserable for their family, but you've somehow struck a chord in them to recognize, hey, someone was nice to me, I could probably be nicer. You don't know. And yeah, no, it hasn't, the political debate doesn't change one bit, but you may have had a real impact.
Well, and like you're saying, I mean, you can't do nothing, and that's definitely not going to change anything. And so, if these things can start to sort of have a cascade effect, you might see some changes at some larger scale as well, right? But you won't see that if nobody starts. Like, somebody has to start somewhere.
Yeah, and who wants to devolve into, civil war? Who wants to devolve into hatred? I mean, makes no sense to me.
Right. And, and again, coming back to what we were talking about a little in the beginning, it's also like we have it this good and we think now's the time for a civil war. Like, think about
Yeah.
our entire lives and how, good we have it, compared to what it could be like. So it's like, it makes no sense. Like, like civil war and then what kind of thing.
Yeah, and I often say the exact same thing. I sometimes wonder, for example, and I think outrage would fall into this category. I sometimes wonder if we're some of what we get ourselves into right now, and our mindsets and the way we're treating each other, is almost a luxury of being so rich. I mean, we are by far the richest place around, right? And our economy is booming. And yes, I know that a lot of people don't have everything they want, but most of us are well fed. Most of us have heat. We have entertainment on these, little things we hold in our hands. We live in a time where you're not dying of plague. You're not, know, uh, I always think of my parents. They grew up in the Depression. My mother was bombed by the Germans. She was British. My father was in the Navy, and I'm thinking it must have felt like the world was coming to an end. And here I'm living fat and happy. Uh, and it almost feels like it's kind of a luxury to be a naysayer, to be down and criticizing everything, as opposed to when you're struggling. There may even be more opportunity there to say, "Hey, I'm going to have to help my fellow man, because maybe me who needs the help next time." I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah. Well, my mom kind of expressed that kind of sentiment, like you say, growing up in the Depression, where there was a lot more of that, where like everybody was kind of struggling, so you were much more accommodating and a lot of the words we might use now, inclusive and things like that, probably weren't
Yeah.
language that would be used then, but you would be, like, this person's hurting and I'm not going to judge. I'm just going to feed them.
Yeah. People would open up their houses. I mean, it's, a whole different, I don't know. It may be that we're just feeling too comfy in some ways. I don't know. And then it just becomes a luxury to scroll and bitch, and that sort of thing.
Right. And it's even true to me, even to the degree that all our problems we have with our country and everything else, even that is like we have it pretty good. Like our
Yeah.
judicial system pretty much works. Our elections pretty much work, and but we're somehow convinced it's awful, and like we're under fascism and this kind of thing. It's like you should see what real fascism looks like. Well, all right. Well, let's I don't know. You already gave some good little practical stars. I do really like the idea of kind of inventorying, where you're finding happiness and where you're finding not so happiness, the opposite of happiness, and and that's an interesting exercise, and I think that kind of self-reflection, I can almost hear listeners going, well, no, but the problem is the other guys. I mean, even if I do that, it's not going to help fix the other guys. And I know we've talked about that a little bit, but and that kind of comes back to a lot of things we've already talked about. But I don't know if you have any other little thoughts on that.
Well, I got another one for you on that topic. I mean, we could dig up a bunch, but another one that I think is a big power hitter in the resilience building world is what we call debriefing stressors. And debriefing stressors simply means to hopefully have people, and you can do it on your own, but it's a little harder, but hopefully to have people who you trust well enough that you can share your feelings, share your responses to things. And to periodically, hopefully you do what we call harvesting uplifts. You do the uplifts things much more than you debrief stressors, but to periodically to be able to sit down and say, this really bothers me. This is something that is really, keeping me up at night, really bothering me. First thing in the psychology world, they tell you that just expressing negative emotions helps take the bite out of them. Okay, that's one level. But the real power in this idea of debriefing stressors is not to sit and complain, which is the danger of doing it. It's to really look at, rather than the stressor itself, to look at your response to it. And that is, this happened and I responded this way. And to be able to, it's really nice if you can talk about it with other people, but you could sit and think about it and write about it and journal about it or whatever. But to think about what was my response to it. And was my response in the psychology world terms, was my response adaptive or maladaptive? And adaptive and maladaptive doesn't mean is it bad or good. Adaptive means does it make me feel better? Does it bring me to a better place? Does it help me achieve my goals? Maladaptive would be the opposite. It doesn't mean that one's bad or good, but if it's adaptive, it's getting you kind of where you want to be, to the plane you want to be, which goes back to emotional intelligence because you got to know where you want that to be. But by doing that, what happens is you pull it a little out of that us versus them, and it's okay. Do I really need to be, walking around the house throwing things over this? Or is there a way that is going to make me actually feel better in a longer term about that? Maybe it is starting a podcast. Maybe it's being a guest on a podcast. Maybe it's writing a book. But, I mean, it can go a million ways with that. But the response is the key. And what's nice is if you discuss it with other people, again, you have to trust them because you're sharing things, and it takes a little while before you can kind of share emotions sometimes. But if you can do it with other people, sometimes just discussing it, they'll say, "Oh yeah, I had a very similar response, and I took this tack, and it seemed to help me." Oh, well, there's an idea. Or they say I took this tack and it didn't work. Well, you can say, well, maybe I'll try it because I kind of like the idea of that. Um, so in other words, if you can share things, you'll find that different strategies start popping up. And, just you're bouncing ideas, you're spitballing ideas amongst each other, how we're not going to let this get us down. And it can be really powerful. Again, we used it very much in our microscopic world of our business. And I think people came out of it feeling much better, like they had more alternatives as to how they might respond to certain things like that.
Yeah, that sounds very intense.
Yeah, it is intense. Again, on a microcosm level, but I mean, it's intense what's happening in our country right now.
Yeah, well, it is, and for a lot of people, it's like, yeah, it's like they're just consumed by it. So, it's difficult. Well, Gary Simonds, thank you so much for making time. I really, I really enjoyed this conversation. That was a lot of fun.
Well, good. I enjoy it too. I think we're coming at things from similar angles. You're a little bit on a broader scope than me, but I think it all fits together. I think we're all kind of experiencing similar things, and the more we can kind of tackle it and try to nudge it into a more positive direction, I think the better off all of us are going to be.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, thanks again, and stay in touch.
All right.
And that is it for this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. For links to everything we talked about on this episode, go to outrageoverload.net. If you enjoyed this episode, if you found it interesting, please tell some friends about it. Post it to your social media. Better yet, text someone. Even better, talk to someone in real life. Tell them about this show. I really appreciate it. Okay, see you in a week or two.